They say never judge a book by its cover, but at this karate class, an elderly black woman named Grace was mocked and underestimated by younger students and even the instructor. What they didn't know was that Grace wasn't just any participant. She was a highly skilled black belt with decades of experience. What happened next stunned everyone and became a powerful lesson in respect, humility, and strength. Grace Mitchell was no stranger to challenges. At 72 years old, this graceful black woman had spent a lifetime overcoming obstacles and proving her strength in quiet, powerful ways. But today, she was embarking on something new, a journey that few expected her to take. With a gentle smile and a determined spirit, Grace walked into the local karate dojo for her very first class. She wasn't here to prove anything to anyone. She wanted to stay active, keep her mind sharp, and maybe learn a few new skills along the way. The dojo was filled mostly with younger faces, teens and adults in their 20s and 30s, eager to punch, kick, and spar their way to new ranks. Grace felt a flutter of nerves as she stepped onto the polished wooden floor, bowing respectfully to the instructor and her new classmates. Her white gi was neatly pressed, her belt tied with care. But for many in the room, the image of this petite, elderly woman didn't quite match their expectations of what a karate student looked like. Grace took her place near the back, listening carefully as the instructor explained the basics of stance and balance. She moved with deliberate grace, absorbing every instruction with a kind of focus that only years of life experience can bring. Though quiet, there was something in her calm demeanor that caught the attention of a few classmates. Little did they know, Grace's presence here was more than just a new hobby. It was the start of a lesson in humility and respect that would soon surprise everyone. As Grace continued through the class, she quickly realized she wasn't just facing the physical challenge of karate. She was also confronting the quiet judgments of those around her. A few younger students exchanged skeptical glances and whispered behind their hands. "Why is she even here?" one muttered. Another chuckled. "She looks like she can barely keep up." The room buzzed with quiet amusement as they watched Grace move slowly but carefully through the warm-up exercises. Some snickered when she took her time practicing basic punches and kicks, clearly doubting she had the strength or stamina for more. Even the instructor, a man in his 40s named Mark, glanced at Grace with thinly veiled skepticism. He wasn't outright rude, but his tone was curt when he explained techniques, and he seemed impatient when Grace asked for clarification. "Maybe this isn't the right class for you," he suggested quietly during a break, hinting that her age might hold her back. But Grace remained composed, choosing not to respond with anger or frustration. Instead, she focused on her breathing, grounding herself with the same calm she'd relied on throughout her life. She knew the whispers and doubts were fueled by assumptions about her age, her size, and her quiet demeanor. But what no one knew was that beneath her gentle exterior lay decades of experience and a mastery of karate that would soon silence every skeptic. For now, though, she simply kept moving, determined to prove that strength and skill aren't measured by youth or appearance, but by heart, discipline, and resilience. While the others whispered and snickered, Grace didn't flinch. She'd faced far worse in her life than a few sideways glances and childish mockery. Instead of responding, she let her actions speak. During the warm-ups, while others flailed through the movements with unnecessary speed, Grace moved deliberately, every motion controlled, every stance grounded, every breath intentional. She didn't try to stand out, but there was a quiet precision to the way she pivoted, stretched, and balanced that some began to notice. Her front stance was solid, her arm blocks clean, and when the instructor demonstrated a basic kata, a form that teaches technique through choreographed moves, Grace followed along with a flow that came from muscle memory, not just instruction. A few students stopped chuckling. Someone near the back whispered, "She's actually really good." But Grace didn't hear them. Or maybe she did, but she didn't care. She was focused, eyes forward, breathing even, mind calm. Instructor Mark paused for a second when he saw her posture during a particular stance. There was something refined about it, something that didn't come from a first-time student. Still, he said nothing, chalking it up to beginner's luck. Grace returned to her place at the end of the row, adjusting her gi slightly, as if nothing had happened. But inside, she smiled. Not because she needed to impress anyone, but because her body still remembered what her spirit had never forgotten. Karate was never about showing off. It was about self-control, discipline, and knowing when to strike, and when to simply stand your ground. And Grace had mastered that long ago. As the class moved into partner drills, the energy shifted. The instructor paired up students to practice simple blocks and counterstrikes. Grace, as usual, was assigned to the sidelines, likely out of caution or doubt. She didn't mind. She observed quietly, hands behind her back, eyes taking in every detail. But one student, a muscular young man named Bryce, had been watching Grace with increasing irritation. He was the loudest in the room, always showing off, always eager to prove himself. To him, karate wasn't about discipline, it was about dominance. During a water break, Bryce walked past Grace and smirked. "You sure you're in the right place, Grandma?" he asked, just loud enough for others to hear. A few nervous laughs followed. Grace turned to him calmly. "Ah, you." The class fell silent. That response, measured, effortless, was unexpected. Bryce's grin faltered, but he pushed forward, ego driving him. "You know what? Let's make it interesting," he said. "How about you and me do a little light sparring? Nothing serious, unless you're scared." Before Grace could answer, Instructor Mark intervened. "Bryce, that's inappropriate." But Grace raised her hand gently. "I don't mind," she said, stepping forward. "Just a light demonstration, right?" Mark hesitated. "Only if you're absolutely sure, Grace." She nodded once. The class gathered in a loose circle. Grace and Bryce faced each other on the mat. She bowed respectfully. Bryce rolled his shoulders like he was preparing for a workout. What happened next would be remembered long after that class ended. Grace slid into a ready stance. Not rigid, not forced, effortless, fluid, centered. Bryce lunged with a wide, careless strike, and in one swift, graceful movement, Grace sidestepped, deflected his arm, and tapped his chest with an open palm before he could blink. He stumbled backward. The dojo was silent. Grace didn't gloat. She bowed again. Bryce's face turned red, not from pain, but from shame. And in that moment, the entire room understood. This woman wasn't here to prove herself to them. She already knew exactly who she was. The dojo buzzed with tension after Grace effortlessly deflected Bryce's attack. Some students were still frozen in disbelief, while others whispered, wondering if what they saw was a fluke. Bryce, shaken and embarrassed, tried to brush it off with a nervous laugh. "Lucky move," he muttered. "Let's go again." But before the instructor could step in, Grace took a slow breath and turned toward the class. "If you don't mind," she said softly, "perhaps I could demonstrate a form. One I learned many years ago." Instructor Mark blinked. "You know a kata?" Grace smiled gently. "I know a few." He nodded, stepping aside. "Go ahead." What followed was not just a display of skill, it was a revelation. Grace stepped onto the mat and bowed. Then, like flipping a switch, her entire posture transformed. She moved with explosive speed, transitioning from stance to stance with absolute precision. Every strike, block, and turn was sharp, practiced, and deeply intentional. Her hands chopped the air with focus. Her feet barely made a sound as she pivoted and lunged. This wasn't someone who'd casually taken a few self-defense classes. This was a master. Gasps filled the room. Phones came out. Even the instructor stood with his arms crossed tightly, jaw clenched, not out of anger, but humility. He'd underestimated her. They all had. As Grace finished the kata, she ended in a low stance, fist chambered at her side, breathing steady. Silence. Then, applause, genuine, thunderous applause. Grace bowed again, her expression calm but warm. "I earned my black belt in Okinawa," she said quietly, "before many of you were even born." The respect in the room shifted instantly, from condescension to awe. One younger girl in the back whispered, "She's like a real-life Miyagi." Even Bryce lowered his eyes and gave a slight nod. No more smirks. No more taunts. Grace walked back to her place in the line without saying another word. But she didn't have to. Everyone had just learned a lesson that no technique or textbook could teach. True strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it moves in silence, until it chooses not to. The dojo, once buzzing with quiet mockery and whispered doubts, now stood in humbled silence. Instructor Mark stepped forward, his voice low but sincere. "Grace," he said, "I owe you an apology. I made assumptions, wrong ones. Your control, discipline, and mastery. It's clear we have more to learn from you than teach." Grace nodded gracefully, accepting the apology without resentment. "Thank you," she replied, her tone calm. "We all begin as students, even teachers." Bryce, the student who had challenged her, shuffled forward. The cocky smirk he wore earlier was gone, replaced by something unfamiliar, guilt. "I'm sorry too," he said, avoiding her eyes at first. I thought you were just old." Grace finished for him, raising an eyebrow. He winced, but she smiled. "You're not the first to think that. But age doesn't erase experience. It builds it." Bryce gave a small, respectful bow. "I get that now." Other students followed suit. One by one, they approached Grace to apologize, to thank her, and to ask questions. Not out of obligation, but out of genuine curiosity and respect. Even the younger girls in the class, who once giggled nervously at her presence, now looked at her with admiration, seeing not a fragile elder but a warrior in disguise. Instructor Mark made a quiet decision on the spot. "Grace," he said, "would you consider leading warm-ups next week?" She paused, amused. "You sure the class can keep up?" Laughter rippled through the dojo, light, real, and healing. What began as a day of ridicule had transformed into something far more meaningful. Grace hadn't just earned their respect, she had redefined it. In her silence, she taught humility. In her strength, she taught grace. And in her presence, she reminded everyone that wisdom isn't always loud, but when it moves, it leaves no doubt. As class wrapped up for the evening, the atmosphere felt different. Softer, more respectful. Instead of rushing to change and leave, the students lingered, surrounding Grace with curiosity and admiration. Instructor Mark invited her to share more about her journey. Grace smiled and took a seat on the mat, legs crossed, posture still impossibly straight. "I started karate in 1969, she began. "In a tiny studio in Detroit. I was one of the only women in the class, and the only black woman for miles." The students leaned in. "I didn't join to win trophies. I joined because the world outside didn't always listen to women like me. But when I stepped on the mat, I found discipline, balance, and a voice that didn't need to shout." She spoke of her early struggles, training in garages, saving up for uniforms, and fighting through injuries, both physical and emotional. She described winning regional tournaments in her 30s, teaching self-defense to women in shelters in her 40s, and traveling to Okinawa in her 50s to train under a legendary sensei. Karate, she explained, had never been about breaking boards or defeating opponents. It's about mastering yourself, your ego, your fear, your anger. One of the younger students raised a hand timidly. "Did you ever think about quitting?" Grace nodded. "Many times. Especially when people laughed, doubted me, or tried to push me out. But I stayed. Because I wasn't training to impress anyone. I was training to remember who I am." The room went quiet. In that moment, Grace wasn't just a student in the class. She was its heartbeat. A living reminder that strength isn't about muscle or age. It's about resilience, dignity, purpose. Instructor Mark looked around at the students. "Next week," he said, "we don't just warm up with Grace. We learn from her." Applause broke out, genuine and loud. Grace didn't bow for the praise. She smiled softly and simply said, "Karate didn't make me strong. It showed me the strength I already had." The next few classes felt different. Not because the routine changed, but because they had changed. The air in the dojo held a new kind of respect, quiet, steady, and deep. Students were no longer just focused on mastering kicks or memorizing forms. They were learning something far more valuable: humility. Bryce, the once arrogant teen who had mocked Grace, was now the first to arrive and the last to leave. During a water break, he pulled aside one of the younger kids and said, "Don't ever think you know what someone's capable of just by looking at them. I made that mistake." Even Instructor Mark, humbled by his own assumptions, opened each class with a brief reflection, reminding students that karate was not just about fighting skill, but character, integrity, open-mindedness. "I've been teaching for 15 years, he admitted one day, "but Grace taught me more in one evening than I've learned in some seminars." The dojo added a new inscription to the wall near the entrance, in bold black brushstrokes. "Strength comes in many forms. Honor sees them all." Parents of students began to take notice too. Some brought their elders to observe class, inspired by Grace's story. One woman in her 60s even enrolled, saying, "If she can do it, so can I." Grace remained humble through it all. She trained like always, helped beginners with stances, and encouraged others with just a smile and a nod. But her presence alone had shifted the energy of the entire dojo. What started as ridicule had become reverence. What started as underestimation had become inspiration. And what started as just another class had become a lifelong lesson for everyone watching. In judging Grace by her appearance, they had revealed their weakness. In learning from her, they began discovering their true strength. It didn't take long before the dojo realized Grace's presence was transformative. A month after the now-famous class where she revealed her skill, Instructor Mark approached Grace with a proposal. Would she consider leading a special weekly session, one focused not just on technique, but on mindset, resilience, and the deeper philosophy of martial arts? At first, Grace hesitated. "I'm not here to take the spotlight," she said. Mark shook his head. "You're not. You're sharing it." She agreed, on one condition. The class would be open to everyone, regardless of age, experience, or fitness level. The first session was packed. Children who once giggled at her now hung on her every word. Adults, some in their 40s, 50s, even 60s, came to stretch, sweat, and learn, some for the first time in decades. Grace's teaching style was gentle but firm, filled with wisdom wrapped in simplicity. "You don't fight to prove yourself," she told them one evening. "You train to remember who you are, especially when the world tries to forget you." She taught balance through breath, power through posture, and confidence through consistency. But perhaps most powerful of all was what she represented. To the younger girls, she was proof that strength didn't require shouting. To the older women, she was living evidence that it's never too late to start again. To the entire class, she was a quiet force, unshaken by mockery, untouched by ego, and guided by years of discipline. One day, a shy teenage girl who had struggled with self-esteem asked Grace, "Do you think I'll ever be strong like you?" Grace knelt down, looked her in the eye, and smiled. "You already are," she said. "We just have to train until you believe it too." And just like that, Grace became more than a student, more than a surprise. She became a symbol of perseverance, dignity, and the kind of quiet power that changes lives. The camera pans across the dojo, sunlight streaming through the windows, laughter mixing with the steady thump of practiced movement. The atmosphere is no longer stiff or skeptical. It's alive, welcoming, transformed. At the center of it all is Grace. She kneels beside a young girl struggling with a spinning kick. The child sighs in frustration, wiping sweat from her brow. Grace gently places a hand on her shoulder and says, "Try again." But this time, Don't fight the move, flow with it. The girl tries once more, and lands it, clean and confident. Grace grins. The girl beams. In that small moment, something unspoken passes between generations. A torch, not of fire, but of wisdom, belief, and dignity. Around the room, students of all ages train side by side, no longer separated by age or assumptions. The mockery that once echoed here has been replaced with mentorship, camaraderie, and purpose. As class ends, Grace bows to the group. They bow back, not just out of tradition, but out of genuine respect. Voiceover begins softly. Grace didn't walk into that dojo to prove anything. She walked in to grow, to move, to stay active. But in staying true to herself, she reminded an entire community that strength has no expiration date, and that respect should never need to be earned. Final shot, Grace tying her belt, walking slowly out of the dojo as children wave goodbye. One banner overhead reads, "Discipline, honor, grace." Fade to black.